All right, we're here at the SSA Convention 2025 talking to Joe from
I'm Joe from Chicago,
Chicago. Nice.
and I'm a humanist chaplain and celebrant. I've been a humanist chaplain in the hospital setting for about 5 years now. I was in hospice before that, and a university chaplain before that. So I've been in the humanist chaplain business for a hot minute.
And is celebrant another thing in addition to chaplain, or just another way of describing chaplain?
Yes, I would say celebrant is what we would call a more congregational role of clergy, where name hatch match dispatch kind of congregational leader who provides baby namings and welcomings, marriages and funeral ceremonies. But we also do other rituals and other ceremonies for people. We're developing and practicing things like wise women ceremonies. I'm working with a chaplain director at a rehabilitation hospital who has developed, and he's a Christian chaplain, but their hospital is working with patients who are often facing poor outcomes for rehabilitation and are looking at the loss of a limb that is not successfully rehabilitating, that is going to need to be removed, and how do they cover them in ritual and community that helps that make that transition from having that part of them to not having that part of them, something that is not aberrant and terrible, but something that that people are witnessing, that people are participating in, and that is happening in a loving space.
Did you say a wise woman ceremony? Wise something?
I really wish that I was more prepared to talk
okay.
about wise
All
women
right.
ceremonies.
Okay, all right.
But my best understanding is that they're ceremonies and opportunities to express gratitude and appreciation for our elders, especially women in the community.
Female elders. Oh, wise women mean, instead of saying, because no one wants to say old,
Yeah, nobody. Yeah,
and then we mean something different by it. We mean wise.
and being a wise woman doesn't necessarily mean that you're old.
Right.
Old either.
Well, I was wondering if the way you described it originally was that they were older, I thought, or elder or something. Maybe I missed that. Because you're saying they could be 35.
Yeah. Maybe
Oh, okay.
maybe
It.
even younger. We have communities and we have immigrant communities from across the world who are here in the United States with us, who begin what we might call adult life. Early and hard. Some of our
Yeah.
folks might remember getting married at like 16 and 17
Right.
and starting a family and working the farm and being old mom and pop by 25.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in
Okay,
many
I
parts
get
of the
it.
world, that's
I
still
think
the
I
thing.
follow it more, like the wise in that larger sense. Okay, that makes more sense to me. So
It's worth a Google.
it's worth it. Yeah, I was going to say you definitely are going to have people Google it. So what? So is this your first SSA convention?
It is.
It is, okay. So, but you've been part of SSA or part of the atheist community for a while, or the secular community, or okay, because you've been a chaplain for a while okay, but not part of the SSA world.
I was present and helpful in my undergraduate because I had participated in founding a fraternity at my college. So when SSA was starting a chapter at my university, they were looking for help. They had never started an organization. They didn't really know how to do that. So I was happy to show up and participate and give whatever advice or support I could. And of course, it was a community that I was a part of. So
Yeah.
I naturally gravitated to it.
Is that in Chicago as well?
That would have been in Ohio.
Oh, in Ohio. Okay. You born and raised in Ohio?
Born and raised in Ohio.
Okay. All right. So tell me then about your larger story. Just going back, would your high school, since I know nothing about you, would your high school friends say, "Oh yeah, I could see Joe being here"?
No.
Okay.
I think
So go back to your story then, I guess, of why would they be surprised?
going back to high school, I was still very much coming out of my parents' home. I grew up with the church. Catholic faith. My father was more of an artist and an existentialist. And he and my mother married in a time when if you wanted to marry a Catholic girl and you weren't Catholic, you had to, the priest couldn't make you convert, but it would be nice. But the kids had to be their butts in church every Sunday and ideally going to a Catholic school. And that's what we did. So I went to a Catholic elementary, middle, and junior high until 8th grade, and then public school from high school and then college.
Okay.
So I really grew up in the faith, grew up Christian, grew up Catholic.
And your dad was also, you thought of him as a believer? He was a Catholic believer in one sense?
He played along. And he did catechism, and he helped sponsor people at the church, and always had a suit on for church. So I think he took his commitment to my mother and to us seriously. At the same time, I think that he philosophically was someone who really was looking after what Jesus was looking after. So I think for him, that was never really much of a compromise.
You weren't aware that he would have had views. Is he alive still?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So you weren't aware as you were growing up that he had like huge disagreements with the fundamentals of the faith or something like that?
I think he kept a lid on his problems with the church for most of my childhood, the vast majority of my childhood, until my brother and I started being more questioning and challenging in high school, and we were starting to learn about, the parts of European and American history and the churches, some of the Catholic Church's role in that. And we started questioning, and then he started being able to kind of come out of his shell a little bit. But there were always existentialist philosophy books lying around. He always wanted us to be thinkers and to do the right thing. And I think when my parents were raising us, there wasn't a Sunday school program for secular kids. Otherwise my dad might have thought to try something like that. Yeah. But the closest thing they had was philosophy. But they weren't teaching philosophy to 8-year-olds then either. All their new advent. But
does he still go to a Catholic church?
No.
Does your mom?
Not really, no. I think that the politicization of the church really conflicted with their experiences with Jesus' ministry, especially as a ministry of universal sanctification of all people, and especially people who society rejects and excludes.
So did they reach a point where did they just fade away from going to church, or did they just kind of be like, okay, we're definitely, from now on, we're not going anymore?
I think they just kind of faded away and probably found their adjuncts, like what media and what spirituality and what ideas do give me life where the church doesn't do that anymore. And I don't think either of them have really disagreed with what Jesus had to say about life and goodness and how to treat people. I don't think that has ever been in dispute in my home.
Do you think they'd still think of themselves as Christian?
I would say probably culturally Christian. They still do Easter, still do Christmas. Maybe I'm not sure my mother even goes. She might go to church on Christmas and Easter just because it's a really beautiful time to go to church. Yeah. Christmas is such a wonderful spirit of hopefulness and of fulfilled promises and potential, and the darkest part of the year turning back towards the lighter part of the year. And Easter is such a great time where everything, all that is dead and rotting away from the winter, is becoming the fruitful earth from which, the resurrection annually of. And she's into gardening, so I think for her, kind of an eco-spirituality became an adjunct for her. Both of them were very much into Earth Day and ecology. Yeah. So. And
I'm only asking all the questions about your parents just to get the context because it sounds really interesting. But you were, I guess, with your brother. You just described high school as when you started asking deeper questions, which is pretty common, pretty normal.
I think so. And there were probably pressure points earlier. I think that within the family, there were already kind of a spectrum of people who were like more extreme and less extreme, extremely religious.
Did because you were because of these family members, that forced you to have some thoughts ahead of time, basically, or start to scrutinize, what do we think about Uncle so-and-so?
You know what?
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I would say we had a couple of headbutting instances that were kind of like, this isn't the kind of Christian that we want to be, and this isn't the way that we want to fulfill what we're taught, and it became increasingly hard to kind of reconcile participating with a community that was becoming increasingly distant from, in a lot of ways, what we thought was what were the heart of Jesus's ministry.
And by we, you mean your family?
My family, it's really weird experience to be, to be trying to follow Jesus in a community where that seems to not be, going in a different direction.
By community, do you mean your local church where you all attended, or do you mean something larger?
More pious friends, more pious family, more pious church community members. When my mother and father were going up through the church, and would have been before it was a conversation they were having with me and my brother in the early '90s. There was, what was the name of the Catholic pro-LGBTQ plus movement? It wasn't Pride. It was something like Dignity. I think there was a very positive Catholic response to the AIDS crisis. That was kind of like, these people are suffering. We always must stand with the suffering and the forgotten and the abandoned. That's what Jesus did and does and wants us to do. And I don't remember if it came from the papacy that, we as Catholics don't agree with that lifestyle, and this organization is not appropriate in the church. And that was a big falling out. But I think I wasn't aware of that challenge. I was like 6 years old, during the, between 4 and 6 years old during the AIDS crisis. Like, I had no idea what any of that meant. But I think that was an early fracture of like, whether we as followers of Jesus are going to live that out, or we're going to participate in a politicization of these ideas. And even
so your family's crisis was centered around LGBT type issues, you're saying?
I don't think that was the center of it. I think that there were more, as rhetoric around hell and judgment started to infiltrate conversations from more pious members of the community, whether within our family or neighbors or associates. That had never been part of our, I don't want to say it's never been part of our Catholic. Of course, we believed in hell as
Yes.
part of being Catholic.
Seems
but
pretty standard in
fire
Catholicism.
fire and brimstone was never part of the pastoral vision that our priests had. And maybe I was somebody who had a very liberal priest growing up who kind of like played guitar and, did prison ministry and, would go out into the churchyard and throw the football around in his sandals with the kids. He was very much like that, like Buddy Christ priest who very easily reached the kids and was almost not liked by the administration because he was so well liked by the parishes that, the parishes didn't think he could do anything wrong, and he wasn't doing anything wrong. But it made life hard for every other priest who didn't want to be that kind of priest, who wanted to be a little more lofty and a little more otherly. Yeah. He was very down to earth. And my understanding is that one of the reasons why he was kicked from church to church was because it was like, hey, this is really great. Like, everyone loves him. He's a smiling, friendly, approachable guy, and we can't have that. How do we get rid of this guy? Like, he's
yeah.
Which is, and what happens to priests like that? They end up in like prison ministry doing work that the other priests don't want to do. But he has a heart for it. He has a heart for the forgotten and the suffering and the misunderstood and the intentionally abandoned and targeted. And, in that way, he was such an incredible model of Christ's ministry to us that, when he left, and it was kind of hard to understand, like isn't that what we want? Like, isn't this guy, like, this is what we want, right? Getting back to that was hard.
Yeah. I went to a parochial school with my siblings up through, I was the youngest, so they went longer. And even after my parents divorced, where my dad was more the devout Catholic, My mom was more or less secular Lutheran. And in Minneapolis, you had like German versus Norwegian was very prominent still. But in the 70s, our teachers were all 70s Roman Catholic. So they were guitar playing, sandal wearing, went to school in the late 60s. So I'm really, you're bringing back memories as you describe some of these things. So it sounds like then that that sort of, you went from I don't know how you would describe what you went from to what then became your views.
You know what? It's funny you say the 60s. I think of it like that newfangled liberation theology bullshit. You mean Christ's ministry to the abandoned, right?
I'm just saying that I'm actually, because I was young, I was just thinking of more the aesthetics of it.
Right.
Not,
Yeah,
I didn't pay attention to any of the theology.
Aesthetics of it.
Yeah, just the aesthetics of it. And not that I even noticed it. It's more like back by the late 90s, reflecting back on my childhood and thinking, oh yeah, my teachers were different from, like my dad and his family, So.
Yeah. The advent of child psychology and Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, like how do we apply what we're learning from Mr. Rogers, Presbyterian minister,
Yep.
and Sesame Street to
That's right.
being youth pastors and youth ministers, and with the growth of liberation theology in Central and South America, how does that conflict with the rise of Jerry Falwell Christianity?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of contention there.
Yeah, I also had such a negative view of, first of all, I didn't really like the Christianity I was exposed to, and just by the time I was in middle school, I was like, yeah, I don't believe any of this. And my mom and stepdad were secular enough in their just basic daily life and the way we lived. They did not normally go to church on any kind of regular basis, that it just kind of seemed irrelevant, and I saw more hypocrisy. And when I would see the TV Christianity, I just thought it was dumb, and they were clearly trying to get your money, and that was sort of my perspective. And of course, the moral hypocrisy was always rich, because there were big scandals that started to happen, people that were famous and so on. But I'm curious about how you would describe sort of what you then went into. Like, what was your view by the time, I guess, you were in college or during college versus what it had been when you were growing up?
I think the switch for me theologically started to be this idea of what does it mean to be a good person? What have I learned about being a good person from the Bible? And I think the question that came for me especially was, what does it mean to that whatsoever I do to the least of Christ's people is the way that I worship Jesus.
Yeah. And this is during college even.
I think that it was in high school that this idea first kind of this way of framing it came to me, was that if I really was somebody who was supposed to fulfill the first commandment of putting God first, the only way that I could put God first with that caveat Jesus gives is I had to put people first. That the most secure way to serve God, to put God first, was to put people first. And that all of these problems that my family was having with friends and neighbors and within the family, a lot of this was stemming from this idea that God comes before other people, and as long as you're putting God first, you can treat those people however you need to treat them according to what God says. And then going back to the New Testament, saying well, Jesus kind of says hey, if you weren't giving me food when I was hungry, if you weren't visiting me when I was sick, if you weren't showing compassion to me when I needed it, that's how you were worshiping me. That's how you were treating me. Mm-hmm. And if you weren't believing in me, follow that along. If you weren't believing in me, if you weren't putting the least of people first, if you weren't believing in the least of people, if you weren't making a compassionate and real effort with people, if you weren't having faith in people, then you weren't having faith in me.
Okay.
Which became this kind of permission to investigate being more of a Christian humanist and pursuing understanding what does it mean to have a people-centered theology that is culturally Christian, and again, I think for me, it just kind of faded away. That
So you
became
weren't
more
really
and more secular.
You weren't really. Yeah, I was just going to say you were. So at that point, you weren't really deciding. Am I going to be a Christian? Am I going to stay in Christianity? Because you were just thinking, yeah, I'm going to be a Christian. It's just how to be a Christian.
Right. How do I
right?
be a Christian in these times?
Yeah, there you go.
You
Yeah.
know,
And it was less of a big doctrinal investigation and more of a moral one,
yeah, I think it was
something to
a
that effect?
I think it was a moral journey. And I didn't wake up one day and decide that I didn't believe in God. I think that was as a result of a long series of investigations and
Yeah, because we're not
into,
yet
like,
to why you're here.
yeah,
Because that would only get you to a different conference.
yeah.
So, but just to stop there for a second, because I'm really interested in that sort of stage. How long did that last? Like late high school or mid whatever to?
I think I was probably in that blob of like agnostic. Like, yeah, I still have a lot of cultural mores and beliefs that are the root of my morality, and I'm starting to have doubts as I investigate this more. Learning about argument and learning about theology, that I'm starting to become critical of this idea. So moving towards like agnostic theist, moving towards agnostic atheist, and now I would say I'm very confidently atheist.
You were saying that you went. I lost the time frame in that you were saying.
I couldn't put a hard timeline on it, but I know that
I know.
college,
Yeah.
by college, I probably would have answered questions like, I'm confidently an atheist, even though in theory one could never prove it definitively one way or the other. Now,
So already in college, you were saying you were atheist.
yeah, I would,
Okay.
I would have been as uncomfortable kind of going out and saying that because of my mother was still going to church. I still had friends back home who were religious and overtly so. But I became more and more comfortable with that identity once I left my family's home.
Yeah, right. Makes sense. I sort of went the reverse, which is kind of interesting. Very interesting, but whatever. So it doesn't sound like you ever really were like, oh, I really want to explore some of these like doctrines, I guess, or is how to understand the Bible or something, so much as it was this moral journey. Is that the way I'm understanding it? And did you get to a point where you were like, I probably ought to think of that too?
I think that questions about like doctrinal journeys, I think questions of like, and it's one reason sometimes I tell people I really do respect fundamentalism in some ways that I don't have the same respect for like buffet perspectives, like, because if you're telling me that like, well, we can decide which parts to believe or not to believe, it's like, well, if part of it isn't true, then how can I be sure any of it is true? And I almost feel like there's more credibility to say, like, look, all of it is true, every single word is true. That's how we know any of it is true. That's how we only know for certain that heaven is real, that Christ is the Son of God, that there's a plan for us, and that his sacrifice has forgiven us of our sins. The only way we can be certain of that is if all of it's certain. And to start engaged with like, well, I think that's true, but I'm not sure that this is. It's like, well, how certain can I be of one thing? If part of it is not true, how can I be certain any of it is true? If it's like, well, this is just a story, and this is actually the truth. It's like, well, that doesn't stack up.
So did you start doing some of that thinking in college?
In high school, I would say.
Oh, even in high school.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say in high school.
By doctrinal, that's what I was talking about. It was more
Okay,
like, I should have said more like just foundational beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea that first God exists, second that Jesus is in some very clear way the Son of God. Mm-hmm. He's not just human, and that kind of stuff. And then all the miracles, the healings, and stuff like that. That's what I meant by just sort of core beliefs that most Christians are going to go, yeah, I believe that.
And it's coming into awareness of like, there are other religions. Like, there are other religions that have had their own holy books, that have had their own gods and temples, who were certain that their gods were real, and that were certain their prayers were heard, and that that we look at, and we call them indigenous religion, we call them pagan religions, we call them any number of other things.
Even the different types of biblical religions are confident.
Can't
People are confident.
even tell you how many times, even as a chaplain today, I hear people ask if I'm a Catholic chaplain or a Christian chaplain. And I go back to that. Catholic is like, for 15, 18 years of my life, I was almost certain Catholics were Christians. But surprise, I guess not.
I mean, there's a certain, I don't know how you view it now, so I'm curious of this, but I mean, and again, my background's classics, so if you're looking at someone who's Aristotelian versus Platonic, say, just in the philosophical world, you'd say, well, yeah, there's some really important details where they differ. But you would also say that there's a lot they share that's very important to understand. And if you looked at Luther's basic beliefs, you would say, well, I mean, Luther would recite the Nicene Creed just like the Pope would. It's not like Luther was saying, "Oh, I don't believe in a resurrection," or "I don't think Jesus was born of a virgin," or they just had these same. I
don't think the transubstantiation is necessarily,
They obviously had clear differences. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that if you looked at their set of beliefs, they're probably mostly close to each other, and even on the areas where they differed, to a person who's not. If a person heard them talk and they weren't that familiar, they might say, well, it sounds like you guys both think salvation's by God's grace, right, in the end? That might be how an outsider would hear it. It sounds like you're splitting hairs on some things. I'm not saying that's the whole truth. I'm saying, to your point, there's a lot. In fact, I remember an article I learned about and read by a Roman Catholic philosopher from Boston University, and it was called Luther. The headline, I think, of the article title was something to this effect: Luther was right about justification by faith. And he was a very strong Catholic-minded guy who, Peter Kraft, he's still alive, who was saying, well, actually Luther had a point here. So anyway, but for you, it was far more, I guess, existential and more like you were essentially jettisoning all the basic core beliefs of what would be in the Nicene Creed or something like that. Is that right?
And I think that even learning about the Protestant Reformation and learning what was Luther's problem with the church? And it's like, well, he objected to X, Y, and Z, and I think those sounded pretty objectionable. Like he sounds like he was kind of like he was onto something there. And then and even other ideas about we need to, the saints are, portrayals of the saints are idolatry. It's like, okay, I guess if you're going by a very strict definition of idolatry, yes, like praying to intercessionary beings to advocate for you with God is kind of like, yeah, I suppose if a strict reading of the first commandment would be a little against that. Oh, but the Orthodox Church they love their icons. Like, don't take away their icons. They love their icons. But that wasn't the way Calvinism went or whatever, or other Protestant Reformation groups went.
What was the catalyst then? As best you can understand it, I know it's very hard to self-reflect, truly self-reflect. But if you're looking back at that time and you reach this point where you're like, yeah, I just don't believe in the resurrection, don't think Jesus was, I don't think there's something distinctively true about Christianity. Maybe there's something universally true in a kind of religious sense, or whatever you were thinking. Okay, I'm not saying that's what you were thinking. But whatever you were thinking, would you describe it as you said it was more or less a moral journey. Is that really ultimately what it came down to?
I think so. I think that if I had to put my finger on the catalyst, it was that seeing hatred in the church for people.
Hatred of a specific nature, or
whether for people who had gotten divorces, or people who were gay, or people who disagreed with the church, or left, or even just had religious differences. Increasingly political differences, but we were seeing those even in the early 2000s about what were the divine justifications for underpinning the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and the rise of Islamophobia. Seeing hatred and of course the sexual scandal within the Catholic Church was seeing the church as an organization with a nice manual with some great advice for being a good person, but which did not seem to take it sincerely, and which tolerated and in some cases advocated for hatred, and in some cases with abortion clinics being bombed and
Yeah.
abortion doctors being murder.
Yeah.
That this was not a moral organization, and that I was just as capable of taking what I had read about Jesus' teachings from the Bible and treating them with the same intellectual and moral sincerity that I could treat any other historical fiction, whether, the Egyptian Book of the Dead or Buddhist canon, or even an act of literary fiction or poetry. That I can learn from something even if I don't necessarily believe that it's factually true. I can think about what it's trying to teach me, and ask myself, how would I be if I acted this way? How would other people be to me if they acted this way? Does it sound good or bad?
The way you describe it almost makes it sound like it was fairly natural journey and not really that difficult. Is that actually the case, or am I just misunderstanding that aspect of it?
No, I would say it's very natural, because I think what was successfully taught to me as a young Catholic was Christ's vision of universal sanctification. And, show me among these things what God has made that is unclean. A great book, I had long since converted, but a book that I thought, oh wow, like this puts this stuff really well, was Rabbi Jesus, which is kind of a historical reading of Jesus' journey.
And when was this?
This was in my MDiv program.
And by converted, you mean deconverted?
Deconverted.
Okay. I know you could say it that way too.
I don't always use that term.
It's fine. I just want to make sure I understood. That's all.
Just like even people who are within the church don't always like how the church talks about things. I'm an atheist, and I don't always like how atheist organizations talk about things. But it really kind of lays out. It said, listen, we're talking about a guy whose mother and father claimed he was a virgin birth. If you're Christian, you accept that as doctrine. That's one thing. But at the time, this was a claim by a family who had a child out of wedlock, and which in ancient Judea would have been a mamzer, and would have been considered fundamentally unclean. Would not have been able to go to temple ever. Would not have been able to go to mikveh and perform ritual purification ever. He would never see the tabernacle. He would, even though he was expected to donate, he would have never been allowed to participate in that world at all, from birth. And that's why we see Joseph and Mary leave him outside the temple when they go in. He's not allowed. He's a mamzer. But who is he outside of the temple with? He's outside of the temple with the other unclean, who have to pay people to take their sacrifices in. He's out there with lepers, who aren't allowed in the mikveh ritual baths for obvious reasons. He's out there with prostitutes. He's out there with women who are within X amount of days of menstruation. He's there with people who have committed social or spiritual crimes which render them unclean and unable to go to temple. He's out there with poor people who aren't able to afford the sacrifices at the temple. So when he goes when Jesus, Mary, and Joseph go to temple, they have very different experiences. They go inside the temple because they have the money and the cleanliness to go. And Jesus is like the kid outside the gay bar.
Just for clarity, you were saying that if I understood you correctly, that this likely explains the invention of the virgin birth story. Is that what you were trying to get at?
No, it explains in historical terms why we see things like, why is Jesus' ministry so concerned with the poor, the poor, what were considered the unclean people? It's because those were his people. He, even if people as believing Christians hold it as an article of faith that he is the Son of God, born of the Virgin Mary, and and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That would not have been a claim Jesus' neighbors would have bought at the time of his birth. And so,
yeah, even the Gospels don't give the impression that a bunch of people
yeah,
just were like, yeah, okay, cool.
yeah, he's just a kid, and he's just a kid from parents like, yeah, Jesus, you and like the other 30 kids born out of wedlock outside of the temple, yeah, like you're all, yeah, I'm sure you're all, yeah, God's all your dads or whatever. Then he meets John the Baptist, who is teaching this idea of you don't have to go to the mikveh, you don't have to pay gold to the Pharisees to go to mikveh and be purified when God's living waters run free in the wild. You can go be purified. You can have that relationship with God. You don't have to pay money to the Pharisees. So the first people who go to John are these abandoned people, these people who don't have any other access to God, to their religion. So they start going to John the Baptist, and he starts becoming this like messianic voice in the desert kind of guy. And so when Jesus comes of age, he says like, I want to learn from you, Rabbi. Like you're leading these people. These people believe you. You're like a prophet to me. So he starts learning under John the Baptist, and the Pharisees kill John the Baptist because this is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. He is.
Or Herod, I guess. Yeah.
He's digging in on their game. Like
sure
this whole pipeline of paying to go to mikveh, paying to make sacrifices, and sacrifices that cost money. Like this is an important financial system for the priesthood, and saying that like, I don't know, man, like come as you are to the forest and be bathed in the streams and be clean with God again. Like this is heresy. This is heresy, and it's the worst kind of heresy because it's the heresy that takes money out of the church of the priesthood. And Jesus gets away. John the Baptist is murdered, and Jesus escapes. And he spends the rest of his ministry on the run in the frontier and the fringes of the empire. He can't go back to Jerusalem. If he goes back to Jerusalem, he's the apprentice of John the Baptist. They'll kill him. He knows that they'll kill him when he goes back to Jerusalem. So his whole ministry is this, like being on the fringes, preaching John the Baptist's message of universal sanctification that isn't mediated by a priesthood, by a financial group. And this was like a really awesome historical picture of like, if you want to know why Jesus was put to death, if you want to know why his ideas were radical and why people followed him, look at this historical narrative of him and see a very different picture of where this guy was and what was going on in his life. And to me, it like really, even as an atheist and an avowed humanist, reading Rabbi Jesus brought me much closer to him again as a spiritual leader, as a historical figure, and as a very important moral philosopher, and someone who was still an important moral philosopher for myself. Jesus was my first superhero.
It almost sounds quasi-religious, the way you're describing, the way you characterize him, even if it's not the traditional. Not everything about it is the traditional view, I know, but I'm just saying it's whatever. It's irrelevant whether it's quasi-religious or not. What about the theological bits? Like he clearly, on at least in the accounts you're referencing, he says a lot more, right? He clearly does talk about other things that are relating to ultimate justice and things like this, and eternal resurrections and stuff like this. So, was that something that played a role in the Rabbi, whatever, I can't remember, Rabbi Jesus' book, or in your perspective? Like, were you at one point in 10th grade thinking, yeah, I guess there's eternal judgment or eternal justice, I guess, if that's the word for it, and then you at some point were like, yeah, I don't think that's true anymore, and that was, I guess, the way to look at Jesus is he just got that stuff wrong?
I think there are obvious things like people are always products of their time. And speakers are always mindful. Good speakers are mindful of their audiences.
Yeah.
I think applying, what's the word I'm looking for? Exegetical and eisegetical tactics to readings to the Bible. One could come to any number of conclusions. based on what you choose to believe was meant versus what was said, and what was figurative versus what was literal, you could read the Bible to mean any number of things, and many people do.
I mean, you just gave a particular reading
Yeah,
of
exactly.
Jesus.
I gave it, yeah, right.
Yeah, which much of it I think is actually pretty obvious in the narratives. I mean, I think someone who read the synoptic accounts would say, yeah, I think you more or less characterized the basic idea of what happened with John the Baptizer and how Jesus had to flee north. And I mean, it's pretty clear that that's what it is. So that doesn't seem subject to needing reassessment. It's kind of what's happened according to the narrative, I'm saying.
Right.
So,
You know,
which you painted as, in that case, reliable. So I was just saying, when it comes to those other things, because he clearly taught about eternal guilt, eternal punishment, things like this. So,
and questions of things like, what does it mean to be forgiven of our sins after a life of sin? You know, it kind of didn't. What is the justice that goes into being hurtful, being destructive, and then, oh well, if I ask for forgiveness, then I'm just forgiven. But
you think he taught that? So if we ask for forgiveness, that's it.
And you know what? I'm not sure that is, but it was certainly ways that it was communicated to me by spiritual leaders and spiritual teachers in elementary, middle, and high, and elementary, middle, junior high, and junior high, and parroted to me by peers in high school and later. And
go to the confession, get the blank check more or less out
right.
of it.
And you know, it wasn't until I read more Felix Adler, who was a rabbi, who kind of said like, look, you know, if you and a comparative religious guy who kind of said like, you know, yeah, there's forgiveness for sin, but not for evil. I was like, whoa, hold on here. Like, what do you mean by that? He's like, well, you know, it's like as soon as you bite the apple, you realize you did the wrong thing, and then you have contrition, and then you can be forgiven. But if you eat the apple and you never regret it, if you do the wrong thing and you never think you did anything wrong, and you feel totally convinced of your own righteousness, that is not, and you pray for forgiveness of your sins, you're only forgiven for the things you feel bad for. The evil that you do that you're not sorry for are not forgiven. And I was sort of like, I don't know how correct that is in the Bible. I don't know. I suppose that could be a reading. That's a lot of Bible to read to falsify this account of this Reformed Jewish rabbi of how sin works. Like, I know sin's a term inherited from Judaism by Christianity, but I'll have to follow up on that. This is an argument which, if it had been presented to me earlier, probably would have had a very different positive effect on my trust in doctrine. If I said, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like, that's why that's why there's remediation for sin, but there's still a separation of sheep and goats in the end by Christ.
I was going to say, Jesus, one thing pretty common, is particularly when they're like the Gospel of Mark, right? Often regarded the earliest, where Mark summarizes his public teaching. He begins with this statement, the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe. And then later, I believe the gospel. And then later, when Peter's asking about how many times should I forgive, and he's like, well, if, he characterizes it as if your brother sins, 70 whatever times, and repents and forgives, would seem to back up what the...
Yeah, what does it mean to repent?
At least it means you're not insouciant about it. You're have some sense of contrition or resentment or whatever, regret, whatever that full meaning is. It certainly means you weren't kosher, if I will say with it.
Yeah, like you're not insincere about your recontrition.
Yeah, you're not like, oh, it's no big deal. I just get to, so it would seem like that at least is.
Yeah, you're my brother. You're supposed to forgive me, right?
Yeah.
Like.
Did when okay, so
I like theology questions.
I can tell. I'm really actually that's why I was asking, because you were painting earlier. I was curious even more now, I think, in that sort of. So were you reading the Bible in college thinking, oh, I'm going to kind of really look at this? Or was that more like when you went to your MDiv type thing?
I did a lot more intense interrogation of the Bible in my MDiv and in CPE, finding common ground with my Baptist and Methodist colleagues.
What seminary was this, or what school was this?
I went to a Buddhist temple school. Okay. And our instructor was a former Franciscan monk. he was very much a seeker who had been through a couple religions in his life.
And this is the divinity school you were talking about? Okay, all right.
But his position was like, I know this is like a Buddhist temple school, but you cannot be a professional chaplain.
So there was still like a class or classes on the Bible.
Yeah, his position was that if you want to be a functioning chaplain in the United States of America, you must understand Christianity as well, at least as well as your average American does.
So then you, during that period, you were like, okay, I'm going to look at this with more of an adult mind and
yeah,
really
this is like let's
scrutinize it.
Yeah,
because
let's
faith in question, that's
interrogate.
what we're trying to do, is scrutinize,
Right, and a lot of things made a lot more sense at the graduate level than they did at the elementary practitioner level of like understand that like everybody has their own individual perspectives on these things. Your job as a chaplain isn't to challenge them on their challenge them and nitpick whether they believe the right doctrine correctly. You go into any church and you may you could ask anybody in any church a battery of theological questions, and it would not be at all surprising for people to answer questions totally contrary to like answer them in ways that would get them tarred and feathered in their church 200 years ago. That like, no, we're Presbyterians. This is what we believe about transubstantiation and the virgin birth. Is like, you belong down the hallway to in the that's a Calvinist perspective. Like, well, then somebody should have told this person that because they're a Calvinist, not a,
Yeah, I always think it's always a good practice to try and, like, first of all, it's good to start with primary sources. Like in this case, the Gospels are our earliest record. Other than Paul's letters, some are earlier and give some window into the narrative of Jesus. But really, the Gospels are where you get the first real lengthy narratives. And I think if you just were stepping back, you would say, well, that final Passover celebration holiday, which takes up in some of the Gospels like a fourth or a fifth of the book.
It was a really important moment.
It was clearly to those writers and to the early Christians, a really, really big thing. And it was big because, not just because Jesus died, and then they also believed they saw him after that they believe he was bodily resurrected, but it's also important because they put a lot of attention on the actual holiday, because the original story was this lamb being sacrificed so that the nation could go free. The sons, firstborn sons, and the nation as itself was firstborn, could go free. So that's clearly the way the Christians interpreted it, was this firstborn, this idea of the firstborn son dying is like in the history of Israel, and becomes like a prototype or a blueprint for the Messiah when he's going to come. That's the way they interpreted it, and that's why they put so much emphasis on this, because the death is he's in the place of all the people.
The way that I've heard that reading, and that's the reading that Rabbi Jesus gives, is that as they talk about throne meditation, which when you look at Christ's practices and his platforms in the Bible, he references the kingdom and the throne and these, which had very specific meanings in terms of theological practice in his time, which kind of points to Jesus being something of a transcendentalist and a meditator of his time. No one had ever said anything about throne meditation when I was coming up as a Catholic. Like that was, that would have been considered like esoterica, that is a distraction from like the important things. But it was part of his life, and it was part of how he envisioned himself as he is a representative lamb who would be sacrificed to. And this is where there's
By
a little.
He, you mean
Jesus.
Yeah.
That offering himself up to the authorities, practically speaking, that he was reconciling something deep and spiritual with his movement, with people who are not participating in his movement, that there was a reconciliation there. And the prophecy of a Messiah promised a rebirth. I have at times in my...
Because the nation was reborn.
Right.
When it left Egypt, it was freed and reborn. Yeah.
And, there are ways that Christ prays so bitterly and humanly in Gethsemane and on the cross that sometimes as a spiritual leader now, reading the accounts of a spiritual leader in the past, I look back and I wonder how confident at all times was he that this was going to work. To be, and it's been a comfort to Christians that I've ministered to know that there were times that we have at least one account in the Bibles of Christ on his hands and knees in the dirt alone, begging God to let this pass from me. Like, let what pass? Like being the Messiah, reconciling humans and God in the fulfillment of universal sanctity. Like, you want that to pass from you? Is that what you're asking God? Like, you can ask anything of God in prayer. That has been such a comfort. That exegesis of that has been such a comfort to people, to know that Christ models a relationship with God where you can ask anything, even things that might seem like we're a little far into the game, Jesus, to be backing out now. But even he on the cross, asks if God has forsaken him or not. He doesn't know, or he either gives the impression that he doesn't know, or he actually doesn't know, and says, into your hands I commend my spirit. What are we to assume about what he means there? I wonder if one believes that Christ rose from the dead, should I understand that he was surprised when he woke up, as the rest of us? Mm-hmm. That it was very strange for him to wake up in his burial shawl and say, like, oh, I guess I was.
Well, he does talk about his resurrection quite a bit before, according to the Gospels. So I guess that part wouldn't be too surprising. But I was going to say a couple of things real quick. So the way the writers, obviously they have him announcing his reresurrection ahead of time. So as far as that goes,
thou shalt not test the Lord your God.
Yeah. So as far as that goes, I guess it wouldn't seem like he'd be surprised. But but even in that bit there where it begins to introduce the Passover festival, it specifically sets it up as they're trying to kill him, and they're trying to figure out.
And he knows that.
They're trying to strategize it. He's aware of it because remember the lady comes to anoint him, and he defends her and says she's anointing me for my burial, and then he goes and has the supper with the disciples where he talks about his death. Mm-hmm. So he clearly is aware that he's going to die.
He knows they're coming.
He knows that he's going to die, and he's also not fleeing the city. He must be willing to do it, or he could leave, because he says, "Take this bread, break it, like this is my body, my blood poured out." So he obviously is going along willingly, even though you have a really good point that when he's in the garden and he's praying, like it's clear that this is excruciatingly difficult.
Could you not, God?
What he's going through is clearly he's acknowledging how difficult it is, and you're right that a bunch of people read that and find great comfort, understandably, from the fact that he's doing that. I was only clearing up that bit. But what I was going to say about the Passover is, right while they're strategizing his death, and he's going to announce his death, Marx really has this, I like the way he says this. He says that it was that they'd come to the day of unleavened bread on which the lamb is sacrificed. And meaning it's his little nudge to you, the reader, that he's getting prepared to die at the time when they killed this lamb. Mm-hmm. And that's where I say
he connects the past to the present.
Right, he's connecting this initial story that the nation would have been left in bondage as slaves in Egypt, had the lamb not died, so they could escape and be reborn, as you were saying.
The other way I've heard,
I was just trying to show how the narrative is really careful to connect the two, and I find that extra confidence in interpreting it that way because the writer is so clear about it.
And that's like all great, like any great literature or teaching, there's more than one level. And the other way that I've heard it is that Christ is the Lamb of God, but he's also the fruit of the tree of the cross, which is the tree of eternal life. And that Christ's death on the cross is not only a callback to Passover, it is a callback to Eden, and that he is not just liberating. He is not just replaying the liberation of the people from Egypt through Passover. He is also redoing the Garden of Eden, because the fruit of the tree of the cross is the antidote of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and
Yeah.
evil.
And there's the announcement about the woman's offspring just crushing the head of the enemy, the serpent, back in the garden. The writers talk a lot about the serpent being the devil, and
Although it's not explicitly said.
the writers I meant of the Gospels,
Yeah.
and of course of the Revelation. So and outside of that, the Jewish literature as well connect the serpent to the devil, right? Even outside the New Testament writings, the Jewish writings. So I'm saying that's why one of the reasons you see the devil turn up in that final setting as a personality that's operating behind the scenes is, to your point, that there's another level to the story which goes back to the Garden of Eden. Then, as you said, he eventually gets buried in a garden and then is raised in the garden, and he's whatever. Is it surprising that you, as a chaplain, in your background, and then that I, as a classicist, that we would have this kind of a discussion?
No, I really enjoy.
Not at all.
I really enjoy theology because I think that the encounters with meaning as chaplains, really what chaplains were envisioned as by J.P. Van Praagh, the founder of the Dutch Humanist League, is that chaplains are expert meaning makers, and the craft of exegesis and eisegesis of, this is what the text says, but if we interrogate it, what does it mean? What is literal, what is figurative, what is poetic, what is allegorical? How do we separate these things, and how do we create a reliable system by which to do that?
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's hard.
It seems less hard to me, but it's probably just because, I'm just being honest, that my impression is it's maybe not always as hard, because the writers themselves will differentiate. For example, when Jesus purged the temple and he said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up. That's what he said, according to the narrator, the evangelist in the Gospel of John. Then the writer says, but he was speaking about the temple of his body, and the disciples didn't know this. But later they remembered he had said these things, and this is how they understood it. So in one sense, it's to your point that they had to interpret what he meant. But it's nevertheless the evangelists themselves, the person writing the gospel, is saying this is what he actually said, and this is what he actually did.
I have to record factually what he said.
Yeah.
But
so,
I can't
but
stop
then there's
and
this level.
re-explain.
Yeah, there's this level of significance or meaning, which is often above. These are signs, which is often above the actual literal thing he did. But that at least helps you as a reader to say, well, I guess they're saying he healed this guy. They're saying he healed this guy, but they're saying there's a layer of meaning to this that goes back to whatever Isaiah said or whatever, that's to be understood. And they're trying to convey that, like in their little statements about it was Passover, and just to remind you what Passover is about.
Yeah, in case you forgot.
This is what it's about, and that helps you to see the meaning. And that's all I was trying to say by saying it's not all abstruse, because that's the writer themselves saying, here's the meaning of it.
Right, and when you have later letters to Romans who have never been practicing Jews a day of their life, like, what does Passover mean to a Roman Jupiter worshiper? Like, it doesn't mean anything. It's,
Right.
Like this, it's completely out of context what it means to be the lamb sacrificed on Passover. It doesn't mean anything to them.
Yeah. So obviously we could keep going. I'm really enjoyed the conversation. We should probably wrap it up, but I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, and you have a unique role, I would think, in the in a secular community where there's not this go-to group of people who oversee sort of those what are they called, the moments of life where you have big changes. Can't think of the word right now.
Milestones.
Rite of passage.
Rites of passage to quote the old,
funerals,
the old
weddings, things like this. Yeah. So I could see that being very, for a secular community, there's going to be still a desire to find meaning in these rites of passage or whatever. It's the best way I can think of describing it. Anyway, it was great to talk to you. Really appreciate having you here.